Thank you very much. I'd like to say I'm living proof that Kurds have friends beyond the mountains. I am sometimes known in Kurdistan as Brendan Barzani. I don't object to that expression. Today, I'm going to address two fundamental questions: the debate over colonization and decolonization as pertains to Kurdish questions, and the current status of the KRG. I should say that I have been an advisor to the Kurdistan regional government intermittently since 2003. That does not mean that I'm responsible for all policies executed by the KRG. It does mean that I did play a significant role in the making of the Constitution of Iraq of 2005, but I am not responsible for all of the breakages of that Constitution, which I can list endlessly. And if I did that, it would take at least 90 minutes to get through all the detailed violations. So let me begin with the subject of decolonization and say at the very beginning, I'm a Groucho Marxist, not a Marxist. I don't find Marxism intellectually helpful. Therefore, I'm not going to be giving a Marxist account of colonization. Instead, I'm going to use the work of a distinguished German historian, Jürgen Osterhammel. I've used his concept of colonialism in my own work. He identifies four features of colonial relationships. One, the control of one political society over another, with the consequence that the latter is deprived of its possibilities of autonomous development. Secondly, cultural dominance, the unwillingness of the rulers over the colony to make cultural concessions to the natives. Thirdly, and obviously relatedly, a superiority ethos among the colonizer. And lastly, he names a contrast between an indigenous majority and a minority of foreign invaders. That last one I'll come back to. He identifies two distinct patterns of colonialism, and this is very familiar for those of you who are historians. Administrative colonialism, where the imperial power in question decides who are the governors, direct administrators, or decide over who is indirectly going to be incorporated as a collaborator from the relevant native community. That form of colonialism is distinguished from settler colonialism, where settlers are deliberately brought into a territory to control it for purposes of garrisoning the relevant area, and sometimes with the long-run aim of full-scale demographic displacement. There are much looser usages of colonialism, particularly in the literature of history, where basically any nationalist in any colony is interpreted as acting to achieve decolonization. I think this literature is usually rather vague, but it does come up with one very important idea. No imperial system succeeds unless it has a set of collaborators. And the relationship between collaborators and those who reject imperial rule is vitally important in understanding the dynamics of various colonies. So how does Kurdistan fit into this picture, if at all? I would say that each of the lesser Kurdistans in Turkey, Iran, Syria, and Iraq clearly meet three of Osterhammel's dimensions: the control dimension, cultural dominance, and the ethos of superiority. In Turkey and its predecessor, the Ottoman Empire, there is no formal recognition of Kurdistan as a state. There was a Kurdistan in Ottoman times, though not in late Ottoman times as a distinct, unified territorial entity. Particularly under the Kemalists, as you all know, Turkification was the rule of the game from the early 1920s, with a deliberate program of cultural assimilation, a coercive one applied to Kurds and others, but primarily to Kurds. And lastly, in Turkey, there has been an ethos of superiority. You go to Turkey, you see on the mountainside, happy is he who is a Turk. By definition, if you're not a Turk, you must be unhappy. And of course, most Kurds are politically unhappy. We must make a qualification here that in the Turkish case, under the Turkish Republic, if Kurds assimilated, if they said, I am a Turk, in general, they could pass. They could achieve equality of opportunity, provided they abandoned their Kurdish identity. So the ethos of superiority was qualified. If you accept the imperial ethos, you will become a Turk and therefore treated as an equal. In Iran, likewise, there's no strong recognition of Kurds. There is a shrunken Kurdistan province, which is much less than the area which is majority Kurdish. The empire of the Shahs, followed by the theocratic regime established in 1979, both have in common the idea that they are a multi-ethnic polity. And broadly speaking, cultural dominance is now exercised through religion, the Shia religion, the Shia version of Islam, to which most Kurds in Iran do not belong. So cultural dominance is expressed. Is there an ethos of superiority? Undoubtedly, Persians have regarded themselves superior to every people in the world since the early millennia before the Common Era. And under the Shahs, Persianization was a deliberate program. Today, under the Ayatollahs, indirectly, there is a program of Shiification. And clearly they regard that as the superior version of Islam. So again, the three attributes are met in some respect. Syria, post-colonial Syria, meaning post-French colonial Syria, there has been no formal recognition of Kurds and Kurdistan. Even in its last days, as the Assad regime was about to topple, it did not agree to recognize Kurdistan's autonomy, refused to recognize Rojava. It was willing to allow local government administration. In fact, it didn't even call it local government. I saw the text. It was local administration, not local government. Denial of citizenship was pervasive in Ba'athist Syria for those Kurds who were assumed to have been illegal migrants from Turkey, even if they were multi-generational. And many of them lived extremely difficult lives without the relevant documentation to prove that they were citizens of Syria. Cultural dominance in Syria was expressed through Baathism, Pan-Baathism, the idea that there is a unified pan-Arab nation to which all the various Arab states should eventually unify. De facto, as we all know, the Assad regime, and it's certainly the Baathist regime under the Assads, became an Alawite ethnic minority tyranny, and the Kurds were not part of that. Arabization was extensively applied under the Baathists in Syria. And lastly, if we come to Iraq, here there is some exceptionality. The British did recognize the Kurds, and they did broadly recognize an entity called Kurdistan without creating it on paper. Mosul Vilayet, as it had been under the Ottomans, is mostly today's Kurdistan. But the motives of the British were clearly imperial, to divide and rule, to ensure that they had Kurdish allies, particularly among the sheikhs and aghas, in order to act as ballast inside Iraq to control the territory. In Iraq, the monarchy was clearly a Sunni monarchy, which was expected to be somewhat accommodative of part of the Kurdish identity. In the aftermath of the collapse of the monarchy, Baathism in Iraq took a different form to that in Syria, mostly based on Sunni Arab dominance. Kurds aren't Arab, so Pan-Arabism was obviously not a cultural home for them. And in Iraq, there were coercive Arabization programs, particularly in Kirkuk and the disputed territories. You know all this. So these three dimensions of colonial status are met in all four of the cases. What about the last one? an indigenous majority versus a minority of foreign invaders. Now, in Turkey, there has been no Kurdistan entity. Kurds are a minority in Turkey. In Iran, Kurds are an indigenous majority in Kurdistan province, but the Kurds are not incorporated into one territory in Iran where they are a majority. Large parts of Azerbaijan provinces are inhabited by Kurds. In Syria, there was no Kurdistan entity. Consequently, you can't identify a place where the Kurds were a local majority until Rojava was accomplished through force of arms. Iraq is the exception because in the Kurdistan entity, including the one established under the Baathists, there was a clear Kurdish majority. Now, this outcome, of course, the reason these cases don't meet Osterhamel's criteria is that Kurdistan had historically already been partitioned by a double partition, the partition of the Ottoman and Safavid regimes, the border of 1639, modified in the run-up to World War I, had partitioned historic Kurdistan, cultural historic Kurdistan, between those two great empires. And the Treaty of Lausanne followed that up by partitioning the Kurds of the Ottoman regime into Syria, Iraq, and Turkey. Now, that meant, of course, that one of the consequences is that the Kurds were minoritized everywhere. But it does mean that Kurdistan doesn't meet the technical criteria of a colony under Osterhamel's definitions. But of course, everybody in the room recognizes that there was a historic cultural Greater Kurdistan entity, but not a single polity. And that, I think, has affected historical interpretations of the Kurdish case. So why are the Kurds not seen as colonized, particularly in the West? I think several narratives operate against that classification in the West and indeed in the Middle East. The absence of European settler colonialism and the brief interval of administrative colonialism by Britain and France in Iraq and Syria between 1920 and the end of World War II, with that exception, these zones were not subject to saltwater imperialism by the European powers. So if you have a very Eurocentric conception of imperialism and colonialism, you say this case doesn't count. But of course, inside Europe, places colonized one another. The British colonized the Irish. The idea that Asians can't colonize other Asians or that Africans can't colonize other Africans is simply bizarre. Imperialism and colonialism is not a uniquely European phenomenon. What tends to happen, however, is that in lots of contemporary historiography, Turks, Persians, and Arabs are all wrongly coded as post-colonial peoples. Islamic imperialism gets a pass. All past and current Islamic empires get off lightly in normative analysis. We do all, I think, have to recognize that settler colonialism did occur inside Iraq, albeit internally within Iraq, with the deliberate infusion into Kirkuk of Shia settlers from the south in order to modify the demographic composition of Kirkuk. That took place in the course of disputes between the Baathists and the KDP in the early 1970s and continued right up until the early 90s. All parts of historic Kurdistan have experienced profound repression. I'll go back to the slide here because one of the things that Osterhamel's definition leaves out is the characteristic forms of repression associated with colonial rule. In every part of Kurdistan, we can identify counterinsurgency strategies that are best understood if you frame them in an imperial or colonial manner. So there were Kurdish rebellions in Turkey, in 1925, 1930, 1937, which culminated in the Dersim genocide, and I would use that expression. And in the 1980s, in the course of counterinsurgency strategy to defeat the PKK, literally thousands of Kurdish villages, at least 3,600 villages, were emptied of their populations, and the Kurds dispersed elsewhere across Turkey. In Iran, there were similar rebellions in 25, preceded by Sheikh Abdullah in 1880, the Mahabad Republic, and the early part of the Ayatollah's regimes in 1979, 1980. They too were all repressed in classic counterinsurgency style. In Syria, parts of the border regions were cleared of Kurds to create a cordon sanitaire to prevent trans-border linkages across Kurds. And we all know, I think, in the West about the maltreatment of the Kurds of Iraq, especially under the Baathists, but not only under the Baathists, particularly the Anfal genocide is well known, with its parallel destruction of villages. Now, if you engage in counterinsurgency in a particular style, you expel, you do not respect a distinction between citizens and non-citizens. You don't seriously respect the distinction between combatant and non-combatant. You're engaging in a form of colonial repression. And all parts of Kurdistan have experienced that and may well experience it again in the future. So let's return to why the Kurds are not seen as colonized. Turkish republicanism seemed French. The French say, nous sommes français, we are French. Nous n'avons pas les minorités. We have no minorities. You are French or you're a foreigner. They don't like minorities. Turkey followed the French Republican model, and that was partly sincere. Once you became a Turk, you got equal citizenship. And in consequence, in parts of the West, particularly those parts of the West that are imbued with French Republican ideology, Turkey is not seen as a colonial oppressor of Kurds. Syria acted in much the same way under the Baathists. Iran is different. Under the monarchy, it looked like a composite monarchy in which multiple ethnicities were, broadly speaking, recognized as different. There wasn't, certainly wasn't a fundamental rule of equality, but it didn't look to outsiders like an imperial regime characterized by the colonial practices of the European empires. Republican Iraq, particularly after the fall of the monarchy, looked as if it would become a republican state modeled on the Turkish and previous French practices. In all of these regimes, they advertised themselves as having been willing to integrate their Kurds. And in doing so, they portrayed themselves as uplifting the Kurds in civilizational status. So that, I think, has inhibited outsiders from seeing the practices inside Kurdistan as colonial. The deep thing that matters, I think, in shaping particularly Western thought is the absence of a greater Kurdistan polity, defeated and conquered by the Ottomans and the Safavids. Instead, people think of Kurdish emirates as rather like the pre-imperial entities of Asia and Africa, tribal entities that were defeated by colonial powers, absorbed into new entities created by the imperial powers, and in consequence, upon decolonization, the principle of uti possidetis applies. That's the Latin phrase for leave every border as it is at the end of decolonization. So the Kurds are seen as disrupting the abandonment of the European imperial structures. Kurds are seen as secessionists, not as people exercising anti-colonial self-determination. This is important because secession means the departure of an equal. That may seem strange to you, but the Confederate States of the United States, when they seceded from the United States, regarded themselves as prior equals and modeled their new constitution on the model of the US Constitution. They were secessionists. They did not say the North was an imperial power that had occupied them. And that's how Kurds are seen everywhere in the West. They are seen as secessionists rather than as a self-determination movement of an anti-colonial kind. Obviously, not everybody thinks that way, but I'm suggesting that that's the dominant impression. Lastly, and not unimportantly, Kurds made bad friends. Obviously, the Kurds who cooperated in the Ottoman repression of the Armenians and the Assyrians left Kurds with a long-run, historically damaged reputation, particularly among European and Christian powers. Those Kurds who became Marxists and who allied with the Soviets obviously backed a losing horse and again damaged their possible public relations in the West. So these are some of the reasons why Kurds are not seen as colonized. And I think the key things I want to emphasize there are the absence of a past Greater Kurdistan polity, Kurds making bad friends, meaning historically damaging alliances, and they are generally seen as secessionists. So what about the KRG? Before the Americans removed Saddam from power, Kurdistan was informally autonomous. It wasn't recognized and did not seek to be recognized as an international state. Nevertheless, it met many of the criteria for statehood expressed in the Montevideo Convention. The entity had a clear permanent population. Of course, there was migration, but it did have a stable population. It had a defined territory, albeit one defined by Saddam's removal of his armed forces and public services from the Kurdistan region. It had a government, at least for a while, a unified government. And it had the capacity to enter into relations with other states. It was recognized by the UN in the administration of UN programs. And diplomats, inverted commas, from the KRG were recognized, met, although they didn't have official status, by many of the European powers. They had some decent prospects of statehood at this moment. Unfortunately, the Kurdish civil war, which lasted intermittently from 94 until 98, damaged their prospects. But the Kurds got lucky. America decided to remove Saddam from power, and the Turks decided not to help them. And that gave Kurds an opportunity to make alliances with the Americans and to liberate the Kurdistan region from full Ba'athist control. So what happens in the making of the Constitution of Iraq? Kurds are very lucky because Sunni Arabs are displaced from power. Most of them refuse to cooperate with the new American-led order. And that means that the Constitution of Iraq, if it's going to be democratic, and it was democratic, it was decided upon by mass electorates in the end, not a perfect process, absolutely agree, but it was a democratic process. The Constitution was in effect made by Kurds and Shia Arabs, the victims of Saddam. What happens in that Constitution is that the Kurds, for the very first time, achieve full constitutional recognition as a federal region inside Iraq. First, inside the transitional administrative law, where Kurdistan was treated as an exception from the rest of Iraq, and then in the Constitution of Iraq, when Kurdistan is treated formally as a role model for future regions inside Iraq. It's easy to forget that now, but the original model envisaged fast-paced transition to regions elsewhere in Iraq, because that was the ambition of the then leading Shia party, steering the Supreme Council for the Islamic Revolution in Iraq. The Kurds had a constitutional partner in the remaking of Iraq. I was part of this process. I was astonished at what Kurdistan was able to accomplish. It achieved the weakest federal government on paper in the world. The exclusive powers of the federal government in Article 110 are extraordinarily limited. And shared powers that would be shared between the federal government and the regional government, were all subject to a veto power by the regions. And the only living region at that stage was Kurdistan. And that basically meant that Kurds had to give a very limited domain of authority to the federal government, but would otherwise enjoy extraordinary domestic sovereignty, particularly over natural resources, their own institutions, representation in external missions. It had all of the qualities of a state voluntarily joining or rejoining Iraq. The very preamble of the constitution referred to a voluntary union. The Arabic translation is sometimes a free union, sometimes a voluntary union. Kurds were not able to get an explicit right of secession inside the constitution, but they understood themselves to be voluntarily reunifying with Iraq, subject to the performance of the constitution. Now, as we all know, that constitution was not implemented substantively. The regionalization program was blocked, particularly in Arab Iraq. Today, there remains a possibility that Basra will seek regional status along the lines of Kurdistan. It's chosen its moment wisely because there isn't a formal government in Iraq. It's a caretaker government after the elections. But we'll see if that happens. If it does happen, then we might see a revival of the regionalization program. Arab Iraq pretended Saddam's oil and gas laws were still valid and refused to recognize Kurdistan's rights to exploit, develop, extract, and export its own oil and gas. I would concede, as a constitutional advisor, maybe the Iraqi government had a point about exports, that they would require some form of cooperation between the KRG and Baghdad. But there was no question of constitutional interpretation about what the Kurds could do in exploiting oil and gas fields that were not in production at the time of being into the constitution. Iraq's budgetary process has been like a set of wolves attacking a live body. It has not resembled a formalized constitutional process in which each part of Iraq would get a proportional share of oil and gas revenues from previously exploited fields. Instead, periodically, Baghdad refuses to give Kurdistan its rightful allocation of shared revenues. The Supreme Court, envisaged by the Constitution in Article 92(2), was never set up. The court which exists in Baghdad is not the Supreme Court of the Constitution. It has no constitutional status, but it was used and later exploited by Arab parties to block Kurdistan's rights. There is no federation in the world, tell me if I'm wrong, without a second chamber to represent the regions and autonomous entities. That was envisaged in Article 65 of the Constitution. It's never come into being. The agreement that the territory of Iraq would be restructured according to democratic processes has not occurred. Article 140 has been blocked. So that all lay behind the decision of Kurdistan to have a referendum on the right to become independent in 2017. And it wasn't just that the core demands and rights of Kurdistan had not been respected. There were other aspects of the constitution that clearly violated democratic rights and constitutional processes, all of which contributed to the Kurds' desire to secede. I would bring your attention to one point in particular. The original constitution was accompanied by an electoral law in which Iraq was treated as one entity for voting purposes. I played a role in that. I was the advisor of Kurdistan to the UN Electoral Assistance Unit, and I recommended that Iraq as a whole be treated as an electoral unit because, number one, it would be easy to meet the gender quota, under which every fourth person would have to be a woman. It would be easy to deal with the diaspora, those who live outside of Iraq, give them the right to vote without having to agree administratively what part of Iraq they belong to. And thirdly, it was the best way of making a constitutional convention. If you use proportional representation to elect the entire set of parties, you would have a basis for a legitimate agreement on a modern constitution. Now, what happened was that the Shia parties said, we don't like this system, we want to have elections based on the provinces. Kurds said that they would be agreeable to this. I pointed out to Prime Minister Necirvan Barzani that without a compensation rule, Kurds would suffer under this provision because it would mean the Kurds would not be rewarded for their high levels of turnout. If you look at Iraq's elections since 2004, the Kurds turn out in very large numbers, less than they used to, but still much larger than any of the Arab parties managed to achieve in terms of support. So what the electoral system change has done is to deprive Kurds of somewhere in the order of 20 to 30 seats in the Iraqi parliament, which prevents them from exercising their full democratic leverage over the Iraqi legislature. Why did that happen? You'll like this story. The Prime Minister told the Kurdish delegation in Baghdad, don't agree any electoral change without consulting with Professor O'Leary of the International Advisory Team. The relevant leader of the Kurdish delegation didn't consult me. Why? Because he grew up in Sweden. Because he grew up in Sweden, he thought he understood electoral systems, therefore he didn't check. So there are problems. With a little bit of expertise, you can do damaging things. You can tell I still feel the pain of that particular process. So the Kurds sought independence in 2017. And that referendum, as you know, in effect went down to military defeat 1 month later, largely as a result of internal Kurdish divisions. And I would say, and I would use these expressions, internal Kurdish treason. But I can come back to that later. So I'm going to conclude by looking back at the KRG 20 years after. I was there in 2005, it's now 20 years later. I'm going to give you a slide of what I presented in 2005 to public audiences when I was trying to explain the meaning of the Constitution of 2005. And I asked myself the following questions. Will Baghdad resile from its commitments as and when Iraq recovers its strength and after the US departs? Clearly, I got that right. Has the KRG focused too much on its autonomy and not enough on protecting its autonomy through power sharing at the center? I'll come back to that. Will the US abandon the KRG in favor of its dual containment strategy? The US, since the 1980s, has had a strategy of containing both Iraq and Iran. And for that purpose, it has decided, after the removal of the Baathists from power in Iraq, that it wants a centralized Iraq to balance against Iran. The problem with this is, of course, if you have a Shia majority in Iraq, they are by definition going to be more sympathetic to their Shia confreres in neighboring Iran. So the American ambition of having a centralized Iraq to balance against Iran depends strongly on having enough Kurds and Sunni Arabs with a small number of Shia to deliver the American outcome. And of course, that hasn't happened. My last question was prescient. Will the Kurds inside the KRG unify? Well, it looked initially as if they would. They created a common administration in 2006. But since then, there have been multiple divisions within their ranks. So why did the Kurds not focus sufficiently on achieving power sharing in Baghdad? Was that the fault of their advisors, or was it their own responsibility? The way I interpret it now is that the KDP negotiated Kurdistan's autonomy. They were preoccupied with getting as much freedom for Kurdistan as possible, making it a quasi-independent sovereign state. The PUK, led by Jalal Talabani, was particularly in Talabani's eyes focused on the presidency of Iraq. And because, in effect, there were two channels of negotiations in which Talabani negotiated with the Arab parties on how the presidency would work, I think there was a failure on the Kurdish side. The autonomy goals were met, but Talabani did not accomplish maintenance of a long-term collective presidency in which a Kurdish president among three presidents would have a veto power. Instead, he agreed that the presidency after 2 terms would become a normal symbolic presidency. And 2 terms would see Talabani through his lifetime. So there was an unfortunate focus on the short-term interests of one leader and one party's interests, rather than a strategic focus on Kurdistan's long-run interests. So that's, I think, why that failure occurred. Let me conclude. What's the status quo? The status quo is a federal experiment that hasn't worked. It's not completely terminated because Iraq still has periodic elections. And during those elections and after them, Kurds are important because governments can't be formed in Baghdad without their say-so. So what we have is a cycle in which the Kurdish parties say, implement the constitution and we'll support your government. And the Arab party says, yeah, we'll sign here. And then they never deliver. And when they don't deliver, they say, well, we don't have sufficient unity among our ranks in order to do that. So that is a constant cycle, and it may continue. We've had periodic civil wars inside Iraq since 2005. I won't belabor the point. Iraq is a land of militias, including 3 sets of Kurdish militia. And I'm not talking about the PKK in the mountains. I'm talking about the fact that there's a KDP militia, PUK militia, and a unified Peshmerga, with the unified Peshmerga being the weakest of the 3. Iraq today has a different neighborhood to 2005. There's no longer Baathists in power in Syria. Alawites have been displaced by Sunni Arabs. So we could see a strengthening of the Sunni Arab hand inside Iraq, backed both by the Saudis and by the Syrians. We'll see. Iran has taken a hammering since 2005, having previously expanded its power. The Shia Crescent was notorious among those opposed to Iranian power, and that's been deeply damaged. All of Iran's proxies in Palestine, Lebanon, and Syria have been deeply damaged. And Iran's own nuclear program has been damaged. Yet the KRG lives, and it is definitely, I say this without embarrassment, the most liberal, the most developed, the most democratic, and in some respects, the most feminist part of Iraq. What are the constitutional futures, not military solutions, that are available? Only 3. Maybe a reset will work. Maybe there will be sufficient support among Arab parties to make a deal with Kurdistan to get the constitution to work. I'm not optimistic. An independent Kurdistan. That's extremely difficult to support, to achieve without US support. Nobody in their right minds would trust Donald Trump with their subscription to a magazine, let alone the entire future of their people, on the basis of a promise from him or his administration. The difficulties of independence are well known. I think they have to be postponed for the future. The last possibility is not impossible, that Iraq would be remade as a confederation of two sovereign states, Kurdistan and Arab Iraq. In effect, this would get Kurds and Arabs out of one another's hair inside Iraq and enable Kurdish self-government on those matters of most fundamental importance. It would require a treaty between the KRG and the government in Baghdad. Will it happen? I don't know, but I think it's a better possibility. As I conclude with all Kurds, your enemies are well known. Your biggest enemies are yourselves, your internal disunity. The PUK, one section of its dynastic house, betrayed the Kurdish cause in 2017. Why? Because it feared that in an independent Kurdistan, it would be outnumbered by the KDP, that it would be the minority party. It chose maintenance of power, and it chose to believe an Iranian general that they would get to govern Kirkuk. If you believe an Iranian general over your fellow Kurds, you have a serious trust problem. And that is the deepest problem to Kurdish self-determination. I'll stop. Thank you.